When a man dove into icy waters to save a drowning German Shepherd, he thought he was just rescuing a dog. But what the animal was hiding led to a heartbreaking discovery that would shake an entire town and leave millions in tears. This wasn't just a rescue, it was a revelation. The ocean was calm that morning. Gray clouds stretched across the sky, blanketing the horizon in a muted silence. The waves rolled gently beneath the wooden fishing boat, each crest brushing against the hull like a slow, steady breath. Daniel Reed stood near the edge, weathered hands gripping the fishing rod, his eyes fixed on the still waters. He'd been coming to this stretch of sea for years, ever since he retired from the Coast Guard. It was quiet, far from the traffic, far from the noise. Out here, the ocean spoke in murmurs, not shouts. And today, it had something to say. It began with a shadow. At first, Daniel thought it was driftwood, a long, dark object bobbing with the swell about 30 yards away. But something about the movement was off, jerky, desperate. He squinted, instinct kicking in. That wasn't wood. He dropped the rod and grabbed the binoculars hanging from his neck. Through the lenses, the shape came into focus, and his stomach clenched. It was a dog, a German Shepherd, soaked to the skin, paddling frantically, its head barely above water. The waves weren't violent, but they were relentless, pulling it further from the shore with each passing second. Daniel didn't think. He rushed to the side, yanked the rope from the cleat, and guided the boat closer using the small motor at the stern. His fingers trembled slightly as he kept his eyes locked on the struggling animal. The dog's ears were flat, its mouth open, and panic flashed in its dark eyes. "Hold on, boy," Daniel muttered, "just a little closer." He reached the dog in under 2 minutes, cutting the engine just as the shepherd's legs slowed in the water. It was sinking. Daniel leaned over the side, plunging his arms into the cold sea. "Come here, got you?" With a grunt, he hauled the heavy, sodden creature over the edge. The dog collapsed onto the deck, coughing, shivering violently, but alive. Daniel fell to his knees beside him, breath ragged. "You're okay now," he said, brushing wet fur from the dog's face. "You're safe." The shepherd didn't bark, didn't whine. It just lay there, exhausted, staring up at him with wide, glassy eyes. Daniel reached for a towel from the bench seat and draped it over the animal. As he rubbed gently, trying to warm the poor creature, he noticed something strange, a strip of nylon wrapped around its torso. Not a leash, not a standard harness, more like a custom rig, a pouch, tightly buckled, secure, but soaked through. He hesitated. What was a dog doing out in the open sea, wearing a harness like this? Daniel sat back, heart pounding. Something wasn't right. He looked over the railing, scanning the water for a boat, a kayak, even a broken board. Nothing. Just endless gray-blue ocean, stretching to the edge of the world. The dog shivered again, resting its head against the deck as if every ounce of energy had been spent reaching that boat. Daniel swallowed hard, staring at the horizon. Who sent you out here? What were you trying to reach? And what's inside that pouch? As he turned back toward the dog, a gull cried overhead, circling above them like a silent witness to the impossible. He didn't know it yet, but this wasn't a rescue. This was the beginning of a story he'd never forget. Daniel had seen fear in animals before, especially during his Coast Guard years when rescue missions pulled injured strays from flooded towns or boats lost in storms. But this was different. The German Shepherd hadn't made a sound since being hauled onto the boat. No barking, no whimpering, just silence, like he'd swallowed every scream along the way. And yet, there was something louder than noise in the way he moved, the way he stared back at the sea with a kind of mourning Daniel couldn't understand. He steered the boat back toward shore, glancing back every so often. The dog lay motionless on the deck, wrapped in towels, chest still rising and falling. But his eyes remained locked on the open ocean, unblinking, unsettled, like he was waiting for someone to surface, someone who never would. "Whatever happened out there," Daniel muttered, "you saw it." Back on land, Daniel parked his truck behind the small cabin he called home. The shepherd didn't wait for a leash or command. He climbed down from the back seat slowly, limping slightly, then stood still, watching. Daniel opened the cabin door and gestured. "You're welcome here, buddy." The dog walked in. Inside, Daniel did what he could. Warm blankets, a bowl of fresh water, and a small portion of leftover roast chicken. The shepherd sniffed it, hesitated, then ate, carefully, not hungrily. No tail wag, no interest in toys or bed. Just survival. Later that evening, Daniel tried to examine the harness again. He sat on the floor beside the dog, gently patting his side. "Let's see what you're carrying, huh?" At first, the dog flinched, but after a moment, he let Daniel unclip the pouch. Waterlogged and fraying at the edges, it was made of sturdy material, custom military-grade nylon. Inside, Daniel found 3 things. First, a small photograph, wet but intact enough to make out the faces. A young boy, maybe 8 years old, holding the same German shepherd, smiling proudly on a rocky beach. Behind them stood 2 adults, a family. Second, a child's woven bracelet, red, yellow, and blue thread, faded, tied tightly around a button. And third, a torn, blood-specked slip of paper folded into a tiny square. Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he unfolded it. The ink had bled in places, but parts were legible. If someone finds him, his name is Shadow. Please don't let him go back into the water. I couldn't save them, but he tried. Daniel stared at the note for a long time, barely breathing. Shadow. The dog had a name, and it had come from someone who knew this animal's heart better than anyone. The clock ticked on the wall behind him. Shadows deepened across the cabin. Daniel looked down. Shadow was sitting now, not lying, ears perked, staring at the door. "You're not resting," Daniel whispered. "You're still searching." The next morning confirmed it. At first light, Daniel woke to find the front door open, just slightly. Shadow was gone. Panic surged in his chest. He grabbed his coat, raced out barefoot, heart pounding. But Shadow wasn't running away. He was down by the waterline, pacing the edge of the shore, nose to the air, whining softly, waiting, watching. Daniel approached slowly. "Who are you looking for, boy?" Shadow didn't respond. But when Daniel stepped closer, the dog gently nudged his leg, then looked out at the horizon, as if to say, "They're still out there." It hit Daniel like a punch to the chest. Shadow hadn't been swimming towards safety. He had been swimming back. The morning fog clung to the shoreline like a heavy curtain. Daniel sat at his kitchen table, the pouch from Shadow's harness laid out before him. He had dried everything carefully the night before, but moisture still clung to the edges of the photograph, and the torn slip of paper curled slightly like it didn't want to be read again. He stared at the picture, the boy's face smiling up at him with an innocence Daniel hadn't seen in years. It wasn't posed. It was joyful, genuine. The kind of smile that only comes from feeling completely safe. And there, beside the boy, sat Shadow. His coat gleamed in the sunlight, his ears perked, mouth open in a dog's version of a grin. It was unmistakably him, just younger, healthier, whole. Daniel turned the photograph over. There, scrawled in faded ink, Tommy plus Shadow, Shell Rock Beach, June 14th. Tommy, the boy, had a name now. Daniel picked up the bracelet next. It was hand-woven, the kind children make during summer break, tied tightly, frayed at the edges, but intact. He wondered how many times it had been dipped in salt water, how long it had been strapped to Shadow's side, a keepsake, a promise. The final piece was the note. He unfolded it once more, holding it up to the light. The ink was damaged, the lines blurred, but something about it made his chest ache. It wasn't just a farewell, it was a plea. If someone finds him, his name is Shadow. Please don't let him go back into the water. I couldn't save them. But he tried. He never gave up. Daniel whispered the words aloud. He never gave up. He looked toward the window. Outside, Shadow lay motionless on the porch, chin resting on his paws, eyes fixed on the sea. Every few minutes, his ears would twitch. Then stillness. Waiting. Always waiting. Daniel knew that kind of grief. He rose from the table and stepped outside, kneeling next to the shepherd. That boy, Tommy, he loved you, didn't he? Shadow didn't move. Daniel placed the bracelet gently on the wooden porch beside him. He wanted you to survive. That's why he sent you. He didn't want you to follow him. Still, no reaction. But Daniel wasn't expecting one. He stood again, pacing toward the edge of the yard. The sea stretched wide and endless, calm now, its secrets buried in silence. Somewhere out there, it had swallowed a child, a family, a story, and somehow, Shadow had escaped it. But not without pieces of it strapped to his back, literally and emotionally. That wasn't just a harness, it was a burden, a mission. Daniel returned to the kitchen, spreading out a map of the coastline. Shell Rock Beach. He marked it with a pen. It was miles from where he had found Shadow, farther than most dogs could ever travel, unless they were chasing something, or carrying something home. That evening, Daniel made a decision. He refitted the harness, clean, dry, and empty now, and clipped it gently around Shadow's chest. The dog didn't resist. He sat upright as Daniel secured the buckles, like he knew it wasn't just for comfort. It was symbolic, a way of saying, "We're not done yet." "I don't know where we're going," Daniel said softly, rubbing behind the dog's ears. "But I promise you, we'll follow this to the end." For the first time since his rescue, Shadow lifted his head and let out a low, short bark. Not loud, not afraid, just a signal. He was ready. The next morning, Daniel slid the photograph and the bracelet into a waterproof pouch, tucked it into his coat pocket, and loaded Shadow into the passenger side of his truck. The shepherd sat upright, watching out the window, ears slightly forward, as if he understood they weren't going on a routine drive. They were going looking. Daniel's first stop was the town library, small, quiet, and rarely crowded. He walked up to the front desk and greeted the librarian, a soft-spoken woman in her 60s named Martha. "Looking for something?" she asked, eyeing the muddy paw prints on the floor as Shadow padded in behind him. "I hope so," Daniel replied, setting the photo on the counter. "This boy, I think his name was Tommy. Ever seen him before?" Martha leaned in, adjusting her glasses, her brow furrowed. "That's a sweet face, but I don't recognize him. Try the missing persons board. It's in the archives." Daniel spent the next 2 hours poring through old newspaper clippings, missing child flyers, and public records. Nothing. No Tommy, no boating accidents reported near Shell Rock Beach in the past year. No families matching the photograph. How was that possible? Frustrated but determined, he tried the next logical place, the local police station. He met with Officer Granger, a younger patrolman who had heard bits of the story from a report Daniel filed the day after Shadow's rescue. "You're saying the dog swam in from the ocean?" Granger asked, skeptical. "I pulled him out myself," Daniel said firmly. "And I'm telling you, he came from somewhere. That harness he wore, there was a kid's bracelet, a note, a photograph." Granger examined the photo but shook his head. No missing boy named Tommy in the system right now. No active Amber Alerts, nothing matches. "Are you sure that's even local?" "Shell Rock Beach is 15 miles south of here." "That stretch of coast is remote," Granger admitted. "We don't get many reports from out there unless someone files directly with the Coast Guard or state." "Can you check interstate records?" Granger hesitated. "Maybe. I'll reach out to the State Missing Persons Bureau. Could take a few days." As Daniel turned to leave, Shadow growled softly. Granger leaned forward. "He always like that?" Daniel shook his head. "Only when something doesn't feel right." They left the station and drove toward the harbor. Daniel hoped maybe someone at the marina remembered a family, parents and a boy with a German shepherd. He showed the photo to dock workers, captains, a bait shop clerk. No one had seen them. No one recognized the faces. It was like Tommy and his family had simply vanished. Back home, Daniel stood at his kitchen window watching Shadow. The dog sat at the edge of the property, gazing out at the water again. Still, unmoving. Daniel's fingers tightened around the bracelet in his pocket. "What are we missing, boy?" Shadow turned slightly, ears twitching. For a second, Daniel swore it looked like he understood the question. The silence answered him. They weren't just searching for a name anymore. They were searching for something the world had forgotten. Nights by the ocean had always been peaceful for Daniel, until now. Ever since the search began, something had shifted. The calm of his coastal cabin felt heavier, the rhythm of the waves no longer soothing, but distant and hollow. And then there was Shadow, growing more restless with each passing day. At first, it was subtle. The dog would sit by the window for hours, eyes fixed on the dark water, as if waiting for a familiar shape to emerge. Then came the pacing, slow, methodical laps from door to door, like a soldier on patrol. But it was the nights that unsettled Daniel most. The howling started 3 nights ago. Not loud, not frantic, just a low, mournful sound that cut through the stillness like a blade. Shadow would rise from his spot near the fireplace, walk to the front door, and let out a single, aching cry. Then another. Then silence. It was the kind of sound that didn't ask for attention. It demanded remembrance. Daniel tried to soothe him. "Come on, buddy," he whispered once, kneeling beside him. "You're safe now. You're not out there anymore." But Shadow didn't look at him. He looked through him, like someone who had lost a part of himself in the sea and wasn't sure if it had ever come back. Daniel's sleep grew lighter, filled with broken dreams, of waves, flashes of teeth, a child's voice calling through the dark. Sometimes he could see the boy from the photo. Sometimes he could hear Shadow barking underwater, muted and desperate. He woke up sweating. The connection between the two of them, man and dog, was deepening. Daniel had seen this kind of trauma before in soldiers, survivors, people who returned from war carrying ghosts only they could see. Shadow wasn't just a dog who had endured a tragedy. He was holding on to something, or someone. One evening, Daniel tried something different. He took the photograph, the bracelet, and the torn note, and laid them gently beside Shadow's bed. The shepherd approached slowly, sniffing the items with quiet reverence. When his nose reached the photo, he paused and whimpered. Just once, soft, sharp, and quick. It was the first real sound of pain Daniel had heard from him since the rescue. "You remember him, don't you?" Daniel asked softly. "Tommy." Shadow looked up at him, eyes shimmering in the dim light. That night, Daniel sat on the porch with a blanket over his shoulders, staring at the moonlit tide. Shadow lay beside him, head on Daniel's boot, silent again. "I lost my wife 10 years ago," Daniel began, voice barely audible over the wind. "Car accident, no warning, just gone. After that, I stopped believing that anything made sense." He paused, glancing at the dog. "But watching you, still holding on, still searching. That kind of love, that kind of loyalty, maybe that's the only thing that does make sense." Shadow didn't move, but his eyes stayed open, listening. The following day, Daniel called the local radio station and asked if they could broadcast a public appeal. He described the photograph, Tommy's face, Shadow's markings, and the date scribbled on the back. "If anyone knows anything," he said on air, "please call me. This dog didn't come out of nowhere. He came from someone." After the broadcast, calls came in. Not many, but enough to give Daniel hope. But it was one call in particular that made the air in his lungs freeze. A woman, her voice shaking. "I think I know that dog," she whispered. "And the bracelet, it belonged to my nephew." The next morning came quickly, but the air felt different, charged as if the wind carried news with every gust. Daniel stood at the edge of the marina, watching boats sway gently in the morning tide. Shadow sat beside him, unusually alert, tail still, ears forward. He knew something was coming. At exactly 9:15 a.m., a gray sedan pulled into the gravel lot. The woman who stepped out was small, mid-40s, with dark circles beneath her eyes and a cautious way of moving, like someone who had lived inside grief for too long. She clutched something tightly in her hands, a folded piece of paper and a photograph. Daniel approached slowly. "You're the one who called?" She nodded. "I'm Anna Grayson." She opened the paper, a flyer, worn and creased from time, and handed it to him. There it was, missing. Thomas Tommy Grayson, age 9, last seen, August 23rd, location, Shell Rock Beach. Daniel looked up. "You said the bracelet?" Anna reached into her coat pocket and pulled out another bracelet, identical in color and style to the one Daniel had found with Shadow. "He made 2, she said softly. "One for him and one for his dog. Shadow." At the sound of his name, the German shepherd stood. Anna froze, eyes filling instantly. "That's him," she whispered. "That's Shadow." He walked toward her, slow and steady, as if trying to be sure. Anna knelt, arms open. Shadow stopped just inches from her and stared deep into her face. Then, gently, he stepped forward and placed his head into her hands. She broke. Tears poured from her eyes as she hugged him tight, her body trembling against his. "I thought you were gone," she choked out. "I thought you all were gone." Daniel turned away, giving her a moment. He hadn't expected this depth of connection, this weight of reunion, but it was undeniable. When Anna finally stood, she wiped her face and looked at Daniel. Tommy was my sister's son. They'd all gone sailing that day. My sister, her husband, and Tommy. They took Shadow, of course. He never left Tommy's side. "What happened?" Daniel asked gently. "There was a storm, sudden, violent. The Coast Guard said they found wreckage, but no bodies. They assumed the worst. We all did." She knelt beside Shadow again. "But you made it back." Her voice cracked. "Alone." Daniel crouched beside her. He didn't come empty. He brought a note, a photo, and Tommy's bracelet. He carried their story home. Anna sobbed again, softer this time. "He must have watched them drown." Daniel said nothing. The moment didn't need more words. Shadow licked her cheek once, then laid down at her feet. Anna took a deep breath. "I want to help you find the rest of the truth," she said. "If there's more out there, I want to know. For my sister. For Tommy." Daniel nodded slowly. "Then we'll find it together." And for the first time since the day he pulled Shadow from the sea, Daniel no longer felt like he was chasing a ghost. Now, he had a name, a witness, and someone else who needed answers just as much as he did. The sea had been calm at first. August 23rd started like any other summer day on the coast. Blue skies, a mild breeze, and the rhythmic pulse of waves brushing against the shore. The Grayson family had spent the morning packing for their trip. A cooler full of sandwiches, sunscreen, extra towels, and a special pouch Tommy had insisted on buckling to Shadow's harness. "For emergencies," he told his mom proudly. "Shadow's like a superhero. He should carry supplies." He had no idea how prophetic that was. The family's small sailboat, the Luna, pushed off from Shell Rock Beach around 10:45 a.m. Tommy sat at the bow, feet dangling off the side, his woven bracelets drying in the sun. Shadow lay stretched beside him, eyes half closed, ears twitching at every seagull that passed overhead. Anna had seen them off from the shore that morning. She waved until they disappeared into the horizon. It was the last time she saw them. According to weather reports later that evening, a rogue squall had formed without warning about 12 miles offshore. It struck fast, wind speeds rising from a gentle breeze to hurricane-force gusts in under 20 minutes. By the time any distress signal could have been sent, the sky was black and the water turned violent. A nearby fisherman reported seeing a flash of red, the sail of the Luna, just before it capsized. No emergency beacon was activated, no radio call, no survivors were recovered. But that wasn't the full story. In a memory frozen in time, we returned to that deck. Tommy clung to the mast, drenched, terrified, his small body nearly airborne with every heave of the boat. His parents shouted, but the wind devoured their voices. A massive wave crashed over the side, sweeping his mother toward the railing. Shadow barked, wild and loud, pressing his body against Tommy to keep him from slipping. "Hold on!" his father yelled, crawling across the deck. Another wave struck. The boat snapped in two. The next moments were chaos, foam, screams, salt, cold, and then silence. Tommy found himself floating, dazed, the world upside down. His father's hand reached for him, but was pulled away by the current. The last thing he saw of his mother was her hair trailing like seaweed beneath the surface. He wasn't alone. Shadow paddled toward him, pushing his nose under Tommy's arm, guiding him toward a chunk of driftwood. The boy clung to it with frozen fingers. Somehow, through the blur of rain and sea spray, he reached for the pouch and stuffed inside everything he could find. His bracelet, a photo, the goodbye note he had written the day before as part of a pretend time capsule. He tied it as tightly as he could to Shadow's vest. "If you get out," he whispered, "take this with you." The next wave separated them. That was the last time Shadow saw Tommy. He swam, blind, broken, driven by something deeper than instinct. Driven by a mission no one assigned, but one he refused to abandon. Back in the present, Anna sat beside Daniel in his cabin, her fingers white around the edges of the photo. "He died saving that dog," she whispered. Daniel nodded. "And that dog's been trying to tell the story ever since." Shadow lay quietly at their feet. His eyes were closed, but Daniel could tell. He wasn't asleep. He was remembering, not out of choice, but because some memories won't let go. That storm had taken a family, but it hadn't taken the truth. Not yet. The photo had faded, but Tommy's face still smiled through the grain of soaked paper and salt stains. Daniel sat at his desk, turning it over carefully in gloved hands while Anna stood silently beside him. Shadow lay on the rug, unmoving, as if he knew the memory carried weight. Anna had given Daniel the missing person flyer she'd clung to for months, creased from being folded and unfolded again and again. The photo in the flyer matched perfectly. Same tousled hair, same mischievous smile, same shirt. Daniel laid the two images side by side. "It's him," Anna whispered. "That picture. It was taken 2 days before the trip. We had gone hiking on the cliffs. Tommy and Shadow were inseparable." Daniel nodded. "I didn't need proof. I knew it the second I saw them together. But official confirmation had to be more than memory. So, Daniel contacted the county sheriff's department and requested a formal review of the items Shadow had carried back, along with the digital scan of Tommy's dental records that Anna had kept since the disappearance. A week passed in agonizing silence. Every day Anna waited. Shadow grew more withdrawn. Daniel started taking long walks along the bluff, looking out at the water like answers might float in with the tide. Then, finally, the call came. Sheriff Wallace himself came to deliver the news. "They confirmed the photo matches the dental records and facial features," he said in a somber tone. "It's Tommy, no question." Anna sat in Daniel's living room, with her hands clasped tight, tears slipping down her cheeks. Not loud, just steady. There was relief, but also grief revisited, the kind that never fully goes away. Wallace continued. "We ran DNA swabs from Shadow's harness too. Mixed in with the salt and seaweed, there was blood, small traces. But it belonged to Tommy." Daniel exhaled deeply. He had suspected it all along, but hearing it still landed like a hammer. "Why wasn't this reported earlier?" Daniel asked. "Why didn't this go further?" The sheriff sighed. "That part's complicated. Your discovery reopened something that slipped through too many cracks. The original report classified the family as presumed dead due to a capsized vessel, but the lack of debris and absence of bodies led the case to go quiet fast. We've got new eyes on it now, especially with that dog surviving." Daniel turned to look at Shadow. The shepherd hadn't moved, but his eyes met Daniel's, as if he'd heard every word. Anna moved to sit beside him, placing her hand gently on his head. "You brought my nephew home," she said softly. "You did what none of us could." Shadow rested his head on her lap and closed his eyes. That evening, as the sunset cast golden light across the porch, Daniel pinned Tommy's photo to the wall beside a small, handwritten note. He never gave up. And neither would they. Because the boy in the photograph was no longer a question. He was a name, a story, a hero in his own right. And thanks to a dog who refused to let his memory sink beneath the waves, the world would now remember. It took 3 days for the specialist to restore it. The note had been soaked in salt water, crumpled, stained, and clutched tight for who knows how long. But the forensic team at the sheriff's office worked delicately. Slow heating, layered drying, and digital enhancement. And finally, what was once a barely legible scrap became something painfully clear. Daniel and Anna sat side by side at the sheriff's desk as Wallace unfolded the copy. He cleared his throat. "You should read it yourselves." Daniel took the page, hands steady but heart thudding. He passed it to Anna. Her eyes scanned it, line by line, her breath caught in her chest. It was a child's handwriting, wobbly but clear. Short lines, like someone scribbling fast with frozen fingers. "If someone finds Shadow, please take care of him. He's a good dog. He tried to save my mom and dad. I'm scared, but Shadow is still fighting. He keeps trying to pull me. He doesn't want to leave, but the boat is gone. Tell Aunt Anna I love her, and tell Shadow, he was my best friend." Tommy Anna clutched the page to her chest as her voice cracked. He wrote this, knowing he might not make it. Daniel closed his eyes. It wasn't just a note, it was a goodbye. A farewell etched into soggy paper, written by a boy whose world was ending, but who thought first of his dog and of the people he loved. "He wasn't thinking of himself," Anna whispered. "He was worried about Shadow, and me." Wallace stood in silence. Even a seasoned sheriff had no words for that kind of love. Daniel turned to the window. Outside, the sea rolled under soft light. It looked calm, peaceful, but now they knew what had been buried beneath its surface. Back at the cabin that evening, Daniel sat at the table, the note spread out in front of him. Shadow lay on the floor nearby, eyes following his every move. Daniel read it again and again. Each word carried weight. Shadow had carried it across miles of water, across pain and terror, to make sure it would be read. The harness hadn't been for supplies. It had been a message, a mission. Tommy's final request. Daniel placed the note in a frame and hung it beside the photograph on the cabin wall. Shadow rose and walked over, staring up at it for a long moment. Then, in a motion so subtle Daniel nearly missed it, he placed his paw against the wall, just beneath the glass. That night, Anna stayed for dinner. They spoke quietly, sometimes not at all. Words weren't needed. Shadow ate his full meal for the first time since he arrived. Afterward, Anna stepped outside and stood on the porch. Daniel joined her, 2 mugs of coffee in hand. "I used to think grief was something you survived," she said, voice barely above the wind. "But now, I think it's something you carry, like Shadow did. You don't let it go. You just learn to walk with it." Daniel nodded. "And sometimes, it walks beside you on 4 legs." They both looked down at Shadow, who lay curled at their feet. Tommy's note had done something no one expected. It hadn't just confirmed the story. It had given them closure. It had given Shadow peace. Because now the world knew he hadn't failed. He hadn't run. He had fulfilled a promise. And he had brought those last words home. The map was old, its corners curled, the paper soft from years folded in a drawer. Daniel laid it out on the cabin table, smoothing it flat with both hands. Red circles marked their current location, Shell Rock Beach, and the site where he first found Shadow. But it was a new pin, added just last night after a call from Sheriff Wallace, that drew everyone's attention. "There's a tiny uninhabited island here," Wallace had said. "Not on most tourist maps. Locals call it Drift Isle. We think it's where the current might have carried the boat debris." Anna hovered behind Daniel now, her arms crossed tightly. Shadow sat near the door, eyes flicking between them. He hadn't whined, hadn't growled, but the tension in his body told Daniel one thing. He recognized the name, or the direction, or maybe both. "We should go," Anna said. Daniel looked at her. "Are you sure?" "I need to know what happened," she replied. "We both do, and so does he." By early morning, the 3 of them were on a charter boat, heading toward the coordinates marked in red. The sea was calm, unusually so, the boat cutting through the water with ease. The captain said little, aware this wasn't a fishing trip or pleasure cruise. Daniel kept his eyes on the horizon. Anna gripped the bracelet Tommy had made, wrapped twice around her wrist. Shadow stood at the bow, nose in the air, tail low, ears forward like radar scanning the wind. As they neared the island, its shape began to emerge, narrow, forested, ringed with jagged rock. No buildings, no docks, just a patch of sand where a boat might beach during a storm. Shadow tensed, then barked, sharp, urgent once. They had arrived. The boat couldn't get closer than 50 feet from shore, so Daniel and Anna took the small rowboat while the captain stayed behind. Shadow leapt in ahead of them, unusually eager. The moment they touched land, he leapt out and sprinted up the beach. "Shadow!" Anna called, but he didn't stop. He ran straight into the trees. Daniel and Anna followed, pushing through thick brush, ducking under low branches, climbing a narrow path that curved around a rocky cliffside. The further they went, the quieter it became. Even the birds seemed to hush. Then Shadow stopped. He stood in the middle of a small clearing, staring down at the ground. Daniel and Anna stepped beside him. There, half buried beneath dried leaves and sand, was the wreckage of a small wooden crate, splintered, sea-worn, and broken open. Nearby, tangled in the roots of a bent tree, were remnants of torn canvas, the same color as the Luna's sails. Anna knelt beside it, fingers trembling. She picked up a small, rusted compass. This belonged to my brother-in-law." Shadow walked forward again, nose to the ground, sniffing carefully until he reached the edge of a low ridge. There, beneath a weather-worn tree, the earth looked disturbed, shallow, uneven. Daniel approached, heart racing. In the soil was a cross, crudely made from driftwood, tied with twine. Anna gasped. Her knees buckled, but Daniel caught her before she fell. "No, she whispered. He buried them. Shadow sat beside the grave, lowering his head. No barking, no howling, just silence. That silence said more than any words ever could. Tommy had survived long enough to pull their bodies to shore, long enough to give them a resting place. And when his strength gave out, he passed the mission to the only one who could finish it: Shadow. Anna knelt at the grave, tears flowing freely. Daniel placed his hand on her shoulder. "You were right," he said. "We had to see it." Shadow lay down beside the mound of earth, his chest rising and falling slowly. He had brought them home, to the last place he saw them, to the place where love never left the shore. The sea was still when they left the island. Daniel rowed in silence, each pull of the oars slicing through the water with soft rhythm. Anna sat across from him, her head lowered, one hand gripping the woven bracelet on her wrist. Shadow lay quietly between them in the bottom of the boat, eyes closed, body still, almost reverent. No one spoke. There were no words to explain what they had seen, what they had felt. The graves, the fragments of the Luna, the wooden cross that a little boy had fashioned with trembling hands before entrusting his story to a dog. And somehow, the silence felt right. It wasn't emptiness. It was peace. As they approached the larger vessel, the captain waved silently, sensing the weight in the air. He helped them aboard, then offered coffee. Anna declined. Daniel accepted, but barely tasted it. His thoughts were already returning to land, to what they would tell people, what they would keep for themselves. The sun had dipped lower by the time they reached the harbor. Orange light bathed the docks, and the town beyond felt quieter than usual, like it too had paused in quiet respect. Shadow walked off the boat with slow, measured steps. He didn't pull, didn't run. He was tired. But more than that, he was done. Daniel unlocked the truck and opened the door. Shadow jumped inside without prompting and curled into the passenger seat, eyes already fluttering closed. He had finally delivered everything he'd carried, not just the photo or the note. He had delivered truth, closure, and a love story deeper than the sea. Back at the cabin, Anna stood at the front porch for a long while. She looked out at the ocean one last time before turning to Daniel. "I'm going to stay with my sister's family up north for a while," she said softly. "But I'll be back. We'll need to plan a memorial." Daniel nodded. "Whenever you're ready, take all the time you need." She knelt beside Shadow, who lifted his head to meet her eyes. "You're the bravest soul I've ever met," she whispered, pressing her forehead to his. "Thank you for not letting the world forget him." Shadow let out a soft exhale and gently licked her hand. It was goodbye, but not forever. After she left, Daniel sat beside Shadow on the porch, watching the last light disappear. He said nothing for a long time, then finally he whispered, "You did it, boy. You brought him home." Shadow let his head rest against Daniel's leg and closed his eyes. Inside the cabin, the framed photo of Tommy hung on the wall, lit by the final rays of the setting sun. Beside it, the note he wrote, and just below it, the tiny wooden cross Daniel had brought back from the island, cleaned, preserved, placed with care. The journey back wasn't just about distance, it was about purpose. And now that it was complete, they could finally begin something new, not in forgetting the past, but in honoring it, together. 3 days after returning from Drift Isle, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left behind. It nagged at him, not a voice, not a dream, just a quiet pull in his chest. He had brought back the cross, preserved the note, framed the photo, but a whisper inside said, "Look again." He called Anna. "I know it sounds strange," he told her, "but what if there's more? What if Tommy left something else?" Anna paused on the line. "If your gut says, go, go." And so Daniel returned. This time, he went alone. Shadow watched him pack with calm eyes. There was no need for him to go again. His part was done. But he watched Daniel with something close to understanding, as if silently giving permission to take the last steps himself. By noon, Daniel was back on the island. The wind was stronger, the waves rougher, but the path remained, the same twisted brush, the same clearing, the same wooden cross. Daniel stood in the same spot Tommy must have stood, looking down at the earth he had dug with tiny hands and a trembling heart. He let out a breath and began searching. carefully, patiently. He combed the area near the grave, scanning the ground for anything out of place. It wasn't long before something caught his eye, just beyond the reach of a gnarled tree root, a glint of something blue beneath the sand. Daniel knelt, brushed it gently. It was a small, rusted tin box. The lid was sealed with a child's determination. Layers of tape, knotted twine, and a brittle rubber band. He brought it back to the cabin before opening it, respecting the sacredness of whatever lay inside. That evening, with Shadow by his side once again, Daniel sat at his table and opened the tin. Inside were three things: a water-warped drawing of Tommy and Shadow on the beach, hand-drawn in colored pencil, sun overhead, stick in Shadow's mouth, hearts drawn in the sky. A second note, this one simpler, barely legible. If I don't come back, don't be sad. I had the best life because I had Shadow. Please give him a home and tell people we were happy. And finally, a seashell necklace, handmade, strung together with bits of twine and sea glass. Daniel sat in silence for a long time, not because he was overwhelmed, but because somehow this little box carried more light than sorrow. Tommy hadn't just written a farewell. He had left behind proof that love existed. Real, joyful love, even in the face of fear. He hadn't wanted to be remembered as a victim. He wanted to be remembered as a boy who loved his dog and lived every day like an adventure. Daniel framed the drawing, placed the necklace gently on the mantle, and added the second note beside the first. He didn't call the sheriff. He didn't need to. This wasn't for investigation. This was for remembrance. That night, as a light breeze passed through the open window and the soft scent of sea air drifted in, Shadow walked over to the framed drawing and sat beneath it. He stared at it for a long time, then laid down with a soft sigh. Daniel smiled. He'd be proud of you, boy. And in that quiet, the cabin felt whole, like all the pieces had finally come together. The first story ran in the local paper, a modest column buried between announcements and weather reports. Dog survives sea, returns with missing boy's message. No one expected it to spread, but within days, it did. The story had everything: tragedy, survival, mystery, and a hero with 4 legs and sorrowful eyes. News stations called, radio hosts reached out, even national outlets picked it up. One headline read, "The dog who carried a boy's final wish across the sea." Shadow's photo, standing beside the memorial cross, eyes fixed on the horizon, became an image that touched hearts everywhere. Daniel was protective at first. He didn't want Shadow paraded around like a novelty. But Anna convinced him. The world needs stories like this, stories of loyalty, of love. And so, he agreed to one interview, just one. It was filmed on the porch of the cabin. Daniel spoke softly, with Shadow resting by his feet. He told the story from the beginning, how he'd found a drowning German shepherd tangled in driftwood, how the dog had refused to let go of a photo and a child's bracelet. He didn't embellish. He didn't need to. The truth was powerful enough. Anna appeared too, holding Tommy's framed note. She read it aloud during the segment, her voice trembling but proud. "Tell Shadow, he was my best friend." That line, repeated across networks, became a mantra of sorts. Shadow wasn't just a dog anymore. He was a symbol of friendship that never faltered, of grief that never gave up, of a love that swam through miles of ocean to be heard. Soon after the story aired, letters started arriving, from children who had lost pets, from soldiers who had served with K-9 units, from mothers who said they held their own kids closer after hearing about Tommy and Shadow. One envelope held a drawing from a girl in Texas, Shadow wearing a superhero cape, standing on a wave, light beaming from his chest. On the back, she wrote, "I want to be brave like Shadow when I grow up." Daniel framed that one too. The mayor of Shell Rock Beach invited Daniel and Anna to a small ceremony in the town square. Daniel hesitated. Crowds weren't his thing, but Anna encouraged him. "They're not just thanking Shadow," she said. "They're honoring Tommy too." So he went. It wasn't grand, just townspeople, some local press, a few kids waving handmade signs that read, "Hero Dog," and "Thank you Shadow." When they stepped up to the podium, the applause was warm and genuine. The mayor spoke briefly about the tragedy of the Grayson family, then about the courage of the dog, who carried a message across waves. Then she bent down and placed a small medallion on Shadow's collar. It read, "For loyalty beyond measure." Shadow blinked slowly and leaned into Daniel's side. He didn't understand the speeches, the cameras, or the medals, but he understood love, he understood presence, and he understood that, somehow, the boy he had lost was being remembered, not with silence, but with gratitude, with joy, with stories passed from one heart to another. Later that evening, Daniel and Shadow returned home to the cabin. The sky above was filled with stars. Daniel sat beside him on the porch and whispered, "You earned every bit of it." Shadow's tail thumped once, software steady, like a heartbeat remembering the boy he loved. The cabin had changed. What was once a quiet place of solitude had become something more, part sanctuary, part museum, and part living memory. Photos lined the walls, letters from children arrived weekly. The drawing from the little girl in Texas now sat beside Tommy's original picture, both illuminated by the same soft lamp. But Daniel knew something still tugged at him. It wasn't grief. That had settled into something gentler. It was purpose. Shadow lay on the porch most afternoons, older now, his pace a little slower, his naps a little longer. But his eyes still held that quiet fire, the same spirit that had carried him through the storm. And Daniel realized he couldn't keep that kind of devotion boxed within one story. One morning, as he filled Shadow's bowl, he said it out loud. "We could help others, you and me, like Tommy wanted." Shadow looked up at him, tail wagging slowly. Daniel smiled. That day, he called Anna. "I've been thinking," he said. "What if we started something in Tommy's name? Not just a memorial, a real program. One that connects rescue dogs with kids going through trauma, loss, illness, anything. We could call it Shadow's Promise." Anna went silent on the other end. Then, that's exactly what he'd want. It began with a simple post online, Daniel explaining his idea, sharing the full story, inviting people to get involved. Donations came in from all over the country. Trainers reached out, therapists, animal shelters. Families who said they wished a dog like Shadow had been there for their child. Within 3 months, Shadow's Promise became real. They set up a small facility near Shell Rock, a converted barn with wide-open fields, sleeping quarters for animals, and a quiet room filled with books, toys, and letters from kids. Shadow would lie in the reading room with children curled against him, listening to stories or simply sitting in silence. He didn't have to do anything special. His presence was enough. Daniel led most of the sessions himself, though Anna visited often. Sometimes she'd bring a child who had just lost a parent or a sibling, and together they'd sit under the old oak tree where Shadow loved to nap. In those moments, the weight of loss didn't disappear, but it lightened just a little. On the wall inside the center's front entrance hung a plaque, Shadow's Promise, in honor of Tommy Grayson. May every child know they are never alone, and every rescue find their reason to keep going. Daniel would often pause to read it when closing up for the night. It reminded him why they began, why Shadow still watched the horizon like he was waiting for someone. One evening, as stars bloomed overhead and the cabin glowed warm behind them, Daniel sat beside Shadow in his usual spot. The old shepherd pressed close, eyes cloudy now, but still aware, still listening. "I made the promise," Daniel whispered, "and I kept it." Shadow's head leaned gently against his leg, a soft rumble vibrating in his chest. Not a growl, not a sigh, but something deeper, satisfaction. Daniel ran his fingers through the fur on his back. "And I'll keep it going, even when you're ready to rest." Shadow didn't move. He didn't have to. The promise had already passed from one soul to another, and it would live on, carried by every life it touched. The first snow of winter came early that year. It dusted the porch of the cabin like powdered sugar, blanketing the trees in silence. Daniel sat wrapped in his coat, coffee steaming in one hand, the other gently resting on Shadow's back. The old shepherd lay beside him, his breathing slow, steady, but different. He hadn't eaten that morning, hadn't moved much the day before. Daniel had seen it before, years ago in other dogs, something quiet that settles in their bones, as if they already know. And Shadow, he always knew. "Hey buddy," Daniel whispered, brushing snow from the fur between his ears. "It's okay." Shadow opened his eyes, just a little. They were cloudier now, but they still found Daniel, still knew him. Inside, the fireplace crackled gently. The photograph of Tommy, still framed and untouched, sat where it always had, beside the note, the necklace, and the medal. A tribute not just to a boy and his dog, but to something eternal: love, loyalty, legacy. Daniel wrapped a warm blanket over Shadow, not because the dog was cold, but because he wanted him to feel held, safe, just like Tommy must have felt in their final moments together. As the morning turned to afternoon, Anna arrived. She knelt beside Shadow without a word, tears already glistening in her eyes. She placed something gently on the blanket, Tommy's bracelet, the one she'd kept since he disappeared. "I want him to have this," she whispered, "to take it home." Daniel nodded, voice caught in his throat. The wind was still. Even the sea below held its breath. Shadow stirred, ever so slightly. His tail thumped once against the wood floor. Then again. Then still. Daniel leaned close, forehead to forehead. "You did everything, my friend. You brought him home. You gave your heart to the world. You can rest now." Shadow exhaled one last time, soft, slow, full, and then, like a wave retreating quietly from the shore, he was gone. No whimper, no struggle, just peace. Anna buried her face in her hands. Daniel sat frozen for a long moment, hands still resting on Shadow's fur. It was warm, then less so. But the warmth didn't leave the porch. Somehow, it lingered in the space around them, in the wind, in the trees, in the stillness. Together, they buried Shadow beneath the oak tree, the same place where he used to nap beside children, soaking in their stories. They carved a simple stone: Shadow, the dog who carried love. Across the sea, you were never just a dog. You were the boy's voice, the world's heart, our angel. People came from towns away, families who had read the story, children who had petted him during their healing, veterans who saw in Shadow what they had once seen in their own partners. And when it was all done, Daniel sat once more on the porch, alone, but not empty, because Shadow had given him more than a mission. He'd given him meaning. And now, it was Daniel's turn to carry the promise forward. The wind picked up again, soft and low, brushing past Daniel's cheek like the brush of a tail or the nudge of a wet nose. He smiled through tears. "You made it home, boy." And somewhere, just maybe, a young boy in the light was throwing a stick, and a shepherd was chasing it, free, whole, and finally, home.